welcome, gentle listeners, to a new episode of Yeah, uh-huh. Uh, I am identified as Phil. I am not Phil, but I could have been. I could have been Philomena, Phyllis, Philadelphia. I've heard of a woman named Philadelphia.
Yeah, right. Philomena.
This week we're talking to Andy. How do you pronounce your name, Andy?
Semotiuk.
Semotiuk?
Yeah.
Okay. And welcome, Andy. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what we're discussing this week?
Okay. I am an author. I've written a book called Solomea, Star of Opera's Golden Age, which is a book actually about my great aunt, who was the world's leading soprano in the golden age of opera back in the first decade of the 1900s. So I'm hoping we could talk a little bit about that. Just by way of background, I'm a Canadian born in Canada, but of Ukrainian background. And my family was born in Ukraine, and the star was from Ukrainian roots. But she went into Italy to become an opera star, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about that. By way of other things about my background, I'm also a US and Canadian immigration lawyer, and I write for Forbes on immigration themes. I've been a contributor with Forbes for over 10 years. I'm married. I have 2 children.
Nice. So I finished a book yesterday, and it's a really fascinating read. I'm predisposed to biographies to begin with, but I was fascinated. She was born in a small village in Ukraine in 1872, correct? This is your great aunt, Solomea
Yes.
Krushelnytska.
Krushelnytska, right. It's she was my grandmother's sister, basically. And you're right. I also am what was your word?
Predisposed.
Predisposed to reading biographies. So I'm with you on that one, Philip. But yeah, she rose from obscurity in that little village to world fame, pursuing her dream of opera.
Right. Um, Sort of a middle class bringing up, right? She was, she did rise from obscurity on the wings of her talents, um, but you know, sort of a middle class environment, right? Growing up, her father
Yeah,
was a Orthodox priest, Catholic priest.
yeah, he was what you call a Ukrainian Catholic Uniate priest, meaning under the Pope, but in the Eastern Rite of the Catholic Church. And that rite, the priests from that rite have the right to marry and have children.
Hmm. Um,
Kind of similar to Greek Orthodox.
Yes, it's actually descended from Greek Orthodoxy. It's
Yeah.
the union of Rome and Byzantium, and you know they had to make some accommodations during that sort of union, and one of the accommodations was that the priests from that Eastern Rite can marry before they become priests, but not after they become priests.
Right.
So people
Okay.
in that rite have the right to marry and then have children and so on.
Yeah. I have 2 friends of mine are of Ukrainian descent. Their father was from Ukraine and their mother was from Edmonton, I believe.
Oh,
And yeah, before I got married for a while, I was roommates with Ihor with one of them, and yeah, I learned a bit about
I happen to
the
be from
Ukrainian church.
Edmonton. I don't know who's
Yeah,
this or what's his last name. Do you remember?
Nad Berezny.
Naborezhny.
Yeah,
Sounds familiar.
I still see the Marco and Ihor. I still see them all the time. Well,
Oh, really? Yeah,
I hike with Marco.
mention I'm from Edmonton. I think they sound familiar. Maybe we've crossed
They're
paths.
they're a big. I think there's a pretty big Ukrainian diaspora there, though, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you guys know there's this war, Russia and Ukraine right now.
Sure do.
So there's been there have been a lot of Ukrainians who have exited from Ukraine. In fact, I think the number is over 6 million people exited the war since February of 2022. And in the US and in Canada, there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians that are here.
Yeah.
I remember when I was roommates with Ihor, I also was working with another guy who had come directly from Ukraine. I think he grew up in Kyiv, and and he went to school in Estonia somewhere.
Oh,
But he didn't speak a word of Ukrainian. It's all Russian now.
yeah.
And he was like, I knew it. That pisses me off so much. It infuriated him. But
Well,
yeah,
there's that's part of the Russian sort of imperial legacy that Ukrainians
Well, it's sort of this environment we're talking about, pre-World War I Europe
yeah.
is almost unrecognizable to us today because actually this village where she grew up, while it was a Ukrainian village, it was part of the Hungarian Empire, right? It wasn't part of
yeah,
Russia.
and then Poland, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
so it was it is today what is Eastern Ukraine. And she grew up in the region that then was under Austro-Hungarian rule, but Austro-Hungary essentially allowed the Poles to dominate that part of that Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the cities were primarily Polish speaking and dominated by Poles and Jewish people, whereas the country was dominated by Ukrainians. 80% of the population of the country was Ukrainian, I think, something like that.
okay. Let's uh how did music sort of develop in her, and how did how what role did that play in her young young life? Obviously she wasn't singing opera at the age of 12 or something, but how did she get
Right.
introduced to it?
Uh, Allow me just to say that, well, first of all, she loved singing, and the whole family was musical. The father was, musical and kind of ran the family as a minor choir kind of thing. And they had performances. Back in those days, they had musicians traveling to and fro through the village. And whenever a musician came, the father would invite the musician over to the house and invite the musician or poet or whatever the art was to display or perform before the family, and indeed in the village invite others to a kind of a concert. And since they were having a concert, they would have the family also perform, singing like a choir or performing various songs together. That was the culture of the time in that family. But allow me to say, I just want to say for the listeners that may be listening, if you're not in opera or you don't necessarily, follow opera, this story is also for you. This is not just an opera story. It's a story about a rise, as I mentioned earlier, from obscurity to world stature. And her chosen path was opera, but it may have been in some other field. Each of us has our own destiny. You may be an architect, you could be an artist, you could whatever it is. But I think the key elements of the story and why I wrote the book were that there was achievement involved, rising above one's own stature at the moment, breaking the ceiling, breaking into new territories, traveling worldwide, etc. So that's sort of part of the theme of the book.
Right.
Yeah, I'm no opera expert, but it is a good biography.
Oh, thanks.
Right. Um, so I
Are
think
there any?
Ukrainian folk
Oh,
songs. Oh, go ahead, Lise. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, are there any recordings?
Yes, there are. And as a matter of fact, if anybody was interested in getting the audio book of Solomea, it's called Solomea, Star of Opera's Golden Age, which is available through Amazon and Audible and so on. There's a cleaned up recording. This is the book. That is a surprise, and well, it's not much of a surprise if I tell you, but there's a cleaned up recording at the end of the recorded book. But
bonus.
You can also go on YouTube and you'll find recordings of her singing. And I invite you, because we're probably going to talk about Madame Butterfly, the opera Madame Butterfly. I would invite anybody who's like really into opera or really wants to get into this thing to listen to her recording of the aria from Madame Butterfly. I forget the name of it, but it's the aria, the famous Madame Butterfly aria. And listen to Maria Callas, who may be more familiar to people since she was more current. She was a star in opera more recently, and compare the voices. I wonder what your readers or listeners might think about the comparison between the two opera stars, although Solomea's recordings are scratchy because they were made in the 1920s, I believe.
Yeah.
So, it's a little more difficult to hear her, but I wonder if the listeners, I wonder what kind of reaction.
Hey, I'm sorry to interrupt a bit, but we are fans of, we both have, well, I know that we have a record player. Aaron, I thought you did too.
Yeah, we have a few turntables here. Not afraid of some scratches.
Don't be afraid to interrupt me at any time. I'm happy to be interrupted.
No, we're very good at that.
If you've got a record player, there are records you can buy of her singing. They're scratchy again, though. They're not, they're not that clean. My daughter is actually finishing up a documentary film about Solomea based on the book.
Cool.
And it'll be coming out in the new year. We're hoping it'll be entered into some of the festivals in the spring. Mm-hmm. And, so there's music. Her music will be in that documentary film. It'll be called, I'm not sure of the exact name, but it's Solomea. And then I think A Family Legacy is.
Good luck to her with the documentary.
What's that?
Yeah, we'd love to talk
good luck
to
to your
her.
daughter with the documentary.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
So did you visit some of the sites that are pivotal to her story, like the La Scala concert hall or opera house?
We traveled. She, along with me, my daughter Natalie is her name, and my wife also traveled. My wife, incidentally, was an editor of my book. She read the darn book 15 times. This book is 550 pages long. She read it 15 times to get all the, kinks and mistakes out of it. So I have to, give her a,
right.
For her role in it. But anyway, she knows the story better than I do. I've forgotten half the story. She still remembers it. But anyway, we traveled together. We went to La Scala in Paris. We were in Buenos Aires. We were, you name it, wherever she performed, we tried to see the concert hall. And when we traveled there, we were able to talk to the archivists at the various opera theaters and got invaluable stuff that we would not otherwise have seen, which is in the book, ended up in the book and also in the film that's coming out.
Great.
Yeah.
So she eventually gets into the, she breaks out. What was her big break in becoming an opera
That's a great question, Phil. That's just a great question. Okay, so like everybody else, you pick a road to go down, whatever your choice is. Me, I picked law, ended up, well, maybe I'm not a lawyer, maybe I'm a writer. I don't know. Whatever your choice is. She chose singing. She had some rough times. She had a failed marriage at the beginning of her life, not a marriage, but a proposal, and she was going to get married, but it soured. And the father basically challenged her. She said, all right. He said to her, all right, what do you want to do with your life? And she says, I love to sing. And he said, well, if you're going to sing, you're not staying here in the village. You're going to have to go to school. And he sent her off to Lviv, which until this war broke out 2 years ago in Ukraine, nobody ever heard of. It was a city in Western Ukraine, but now is a sort of a marshalling city for reporters and diplomats and so on in Western Ukraine that are, involved in covering Ukrainian events, and has become quite well known. People are broadcasting from there and so on. Anyway, she went there. She went to opera school. So she's in school. She graduates. She's got her premiere. There's this opera that she performs in as a graduation kind of a thing. And there's this lady named Bellincioni, who's an Italian opera star, who came by and saw her. And she met up with her. And she said, listen, you got a nice voice, but you need training. And you're not going to get it here. You're going to have to go to Italy, which is true, because opera was in Italy, not in, Western Ukraine.
Right.
But this, the family was not exactly rolling in the wealth to send one of 8 children to opera school in Italy. But the father borrowed the money and sent her off to opera school in Italy. And Bellincioni set her up with this lady named Fausta Crespi, who was one of the best opera teachers in Milan. So she's in Milan. Now, we're just skipping over a lot of history, but basically what's happening is, as she's learning opera, they're running out of money. And the father can only carry this show so far. And Crespi notices, she observes and sees, and she says to Solomea, she says, listen, why don't you go and audition to some of the theatrical groups that are collecting singers for operas in and around Milan? And back then, Milan was kind of like Broadway in New York today. There's Broadway, and then there's off-Broadway. And today, and back there was La Scala, the main opera theater in Milan, and then there was off Broadway, the miniature or little theaters that were recruiting and so on. And one such theater from Cremona was going to stage one of the operas that had been written by this guy Puccini, Giacomo Puccini. And he was rising in fame then. Now, he became one of the world's greatest opera composers later on. But back then, this is now in the late 1800s, he's just rising to fame. And he's got this opera, Madame Lescaut, that he wants to perform in Cremona. And he's looking for singers. And she auditions. And in the course of auditioning, and preparing, one day while she's, performing, auditioning, this lanky, tall, skinnier kind of a guy with bulging eyes shows up at the theater and's watching her perform. And when she finishes, he goes up to her and he says, okay, are you ready? And I'm kind of rewording it. It's not exact words, but a conversation along this line. Are you ready? She said, ready? Ready for what? To prepare for this opera. And she says, well, I am preparing. I'm studying it now. He said, no, really prepare. What do you mean really prepare? He says, well, I have a teacher for you. I want you to study under this conductor who is one of, now he didn't say this, but it was one of the greatest conductors around at the time. He says, I want you to study with him. And she says, well, okay, yeah, sure. And that's how she got, that was her big break. She didn't know that was Puccini. That was the first time they met.
And it became a huge relationship. They became lifelong friends after that, right? And in fact,
yes, they did.
We'll probably get to it in a minute. He sort of You might
She
say
saves
that she
Madame
helped save
Butterfly.
his career at one point almost.
Yeah, yeah. Now they became great friends. They performed the Madame Lescaut and other theaters. She started picking up roles, and that helped pay for her education. And she started rising in fame. Now, it took a while, it took a few years for her to rise to the height of her fame. And she performed in operas, not just in Milan, but all over, Europe, basically. And for example, there was a time when she was in Poland for a few years where she was performing regularly at the Polish Opera. And a little story about that. We went to Poland, we went to Warsaw, and we were digging around in there, at the Opera Theater. And we had a very extraordinary experience. It's not in the book, but this experience. It's raining. We're standing outside the Opera House, Opera Theater in Poland, in Warsaw, looking, kind of through the windows of the doors to the opera. It's closed, can't open the door. And a guy comes out from inside. This is in the morning, around 10 o'clock. A guy comes out from the opera, and he sees us kind of looking through the doors. He says, "You looking to get inside?" And we say, "Yeah, we're from Canada, and we're doing this book and theater, and we're shooting some film." He says, "Well, come on in." And he had an art display there. He was a painter, and he had a whole art display. So he's showing us this art display. We couldn't see the theater itself, but just the foyer. And we're going with through the foyer, looking at his artwork. And we pass this statue. Oh, and we look closely, and it's a statue of Solomea, of Krushelnytska, Solomea
Wow.
from the book.
Wow. Well, that's yeah.
You
That
know,
speaks to her obvious her stardom
yeah.
fame at the time. You talk about
Especially since they got pretty nasty towards her there for a while, didn't they?
After, in the later part of her performances there were some
bad reviews.
outbreaks during her performances, and now there was a clash there um, over
Over nationalism,
nationality.
really.
Yeah, like she always affirmed, "Look, I'm a Ukrainian. I'm a Ukrainian by root. My roots are Ukrainian. I'm a Ukrainian singer." But when she went to Italy and she performed in Italy, she became part of an Italian troupe that toured, and she was in Tsarist Russia, in Odessa and St. Petersburg with this Italian troupe, and she was called an Italian opera star. And there was an interview done by a journalist, and his report ended up in the Polish newspapers, and some Polish sort of patriots got upset that she's calling herself an Italian opera star when she was trained in what then was Poland, or under Polish rule anyway. And there was some debate over, well, is she Italian opera, or Polish, or Ukrainian, and so on. And that kind of spilled over into her performances, to the point where she loved Poland. It's not that she hated Poland or she didn't like Polish opera. In fact, Halka, which was one of the great Polish operas, was her favorite. And there's a quotation, I can't give you the
She's a
exact
singer of
quotation.
the Italian school, I guess.
Yeah,
Right?
that's right. That's what she said. But in singing Halka, just as a description of how powerful she was in that Polish opera, one of the journalists wrote, when she sang, and it was a sad song in the Halka opera. It made your flesh crawl to hear her cries in the opera. That's a very loose, raw translation or recounting of
Yeah.
of
Well,
the
you say in the book, you talk about how the recordings do not capture the experience of the live performance, and that's
yeah.
understandable, especially due to the age of it, of some of the recordings. But I think that you also mentioned the YouTube videos. There was one that I listened to of her portraying Brunhild from
Oh
The
yeah.
Ring of the Nibelungen by
Yep.
Wagner. And I
Yep.
want to play that a little bit right now, and maybe people can close their eyes and they can imagine some of the white noise removed from it, and maybe imagine what her voice may have sounded like.
That's
Uh,
great.
Play that. Man, but she also was very prominent. We talk about the Italian opera, but she also was she was a soprano, we should mention. But the works of Wagner, she actually popularized a lot of those. She was enormously, we think about the people she kept company with, like Arturo Tuscanini, and Puccini
Caruso. Yeah.
and Enrico Caruso, and some of these people that have lasted through the ages of opera music, and maybe her name is not filtered through, and we'll get to the reason that may have contributed to that. But the thing to keep in mind is she was enormously influential during her time, and she helped popularize the Wagnerian operas. That they were a little bit older than the productions. They were a little
Yes.
bit older, right? And
Yeah.
also they hadn't been tainted by the nationalistic uh, connotations that they have today, but they are considered masterpieces. And
They are
speak.
indeed, and there was a popular view among opera stars that if you sing Wagnerian operas, you're going to ruin your voice. There was they tended to be reluctant to sing in that style. Um, but she sang. In fact, she debuted several operas from that style in Italy. And there were three sort of three elements to her success. One was Wagnerian, the other was Italian, and then there was French. And I'll just say a few words about why she rose to fame. Okay, she met Puccini. She sang, had a nice voice. She had an enchanting voice, which was just a gift from God, I guess. I don't know. But here's why she rose to fame. Number one, she spoke 8 languages. 8. Number two, she knew over 60 operas, the lyrics and the music by heart. When she taught later in life students, she would talk about an opera, and she could just on the spot break into an area or a part of an opera and sing it to the student right on the spot, because she was on top of that. But there were a couple of other things. She was beautiful as a woman, you'll see from the pictures. But also, she studied acting, and she really picked up on acting. So she not only, stood there and sang, but she was able to enchant the audience to see her as the person who's singing in the opera, the character that's in the opera.
She embodied the characters,
Very,
emoted.
She was
that's
sort of
exactly
method
right.
too, I guess, because like the Madame Butterfly, didn't she stay in costume for the whole time pretty much?
Thank you for mentioning that, Aaron. Yeah, that's if you'll allow me, I would like to tell you the story of Madame Butterfly. So that's an opera that Puccini had already performed several, composed and succeeded in several operas, and he was looking for a new opera to put on. But he didn't have any great inspiration, so he took a trip to London, England. And in London, he saw a play which was based on the story of Madame Butterfly. And he fell in love with it. And he talked to the stage play writer and convinced him to give him the rights so that he could put an opera together and stage it at La Scala in Milan. So he got the rights. He came back to Milan. He organized the whole crew and wrote the opera, and they staged it. And the premiere, it took a long time. I don't know, a year or two anyway, for him to just do this to prepare it. And he to succeed with it, he chose to engage some of the top opera singers of the day, not Solomea, but a lady named Storchio, Rosanna Storchio, and another guy named Zanatello, and a few other top names in the opera world. And he was so confident that when he puts on that opera at La Scala, that it would be a great success, that for the first time, he invited his family members to come and be there at the premiere. So his sister and his little boy was there. But when they put on that performance, for some reason, it just was not clicking. It just was not working. And you could tell even before the night of the opening that the cast was nervous. The star performers were edgy, skittish. Puccini himself was chain smoking. The crowd was restless. When they put on the performance, shortly after they started, the crowd started yelling out and whistling and howling, and they barely made it through the whole performance. When the curtain fell, there was no great hurrah or anything like that, and Puccini was crushed. He couldn't believe it. Now, and he didn't know what to do about it. Now, a little bit about the story of the opera as it was redone, recast, and I'll come to that in a second, but I'll just tell you, when Puccini finished that first run, that first night, because it was so poorly received, he canceled the whole run. And he went to his good friend, Arturo Toscanini, who was probably one of the greatest opera conductors of all time, to ask, what do I do? I don't know. This opera is a disaster. It's, I love this opera. And Tuscanini said to him, listen, if you want to put this opera on, you go see Solomea Krushelnytska. She's the only one that's going to be able to help you put this together. And so Puccini went to Solomea and talked to her about putting on a restaging of this opera in Brescia, like 60 miles away from Milan. Now, at that time, Solomea was already at the top of her fame. She had already performed many premieres and some of the top operas that were going at that time. So it was a big risk for her to go on to this opera. And there's a big challenge for her also. She was already in her
It had already bombed, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he had bombed. This is like going to see Julia Roberts and saying, hey, Julia, would you perform in a film that's already bombed, that starred Sandra Bullock, to see if we can resurrect this film? Well, no,
Yeah.
right? But they were friends.
Yeah.
And she felt, well, I'll help him. I'll work with him. And they worked together for months together, rewriting the opera. There was a structural problem with the opera. I think I don't remember the exact structural details, but they had to restructure it into three acts, I believe.
Yeah, it was a really long second act, I think,
There
that
you
he
go. There you go.
made into 3 acts and added an aria at the end or something.
Right. Yeah, something to that effect.
So they did that. Now, as Aaron, you mentioned, to prepare to sing the role, I mentioned that she was
I
30.
read this morning, so
She's 30 years old. She has to play a teenager. So she wore a Japanese kimono for like 2 months, 2 or 3 months, to get into the role, as you put it, Lisa, before.
Andy, would you say she was kind of, I could be called a method actor?
in that instance, at least she was.
Yeah.
She's kind
Yeah.
of in her
She
regular
was,
life absorbed it.
She, for what it's worth, she was a theatrical soprano, which that's not answering your question, but it's in the same realm. And to be such a soprano, you have to be able to act along the lines of what you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
So, so they prepared, and in Brescia at the Teatro Grande a few months later, they had the opening premiere, second premiere now for the opera Madame Butterfly. Now, the story of that opera is this. It's about a geisha girl named Chiyo-Chiyo-san. Chiyo-Chiyo-san is butterfly in Japanese. So this geisha girl falls in love with a guy named Pinkerton, who is an American naval officer who had come with the American Navy to open up Japan back in the 1800s in Nagasaki. And they have a romantic relationship, and they even marry according to Japanese custom. And then Pinkerton announces to Chiyo-Chiyo-san, he says, look, I have to go back to America. The Navy's calling me back, but I promise you I'll come back. And she says, okay, I'll wait. So he leaves, and she waits a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4, 5 years. And finally, one day he returns. But when he returns, he brings along with him an American wife in tow. And a crisis erupts between Pinkerton and Chiyo-Chiyo-san about this young child, this young boy that she had, that he was unaware of when he left. And the question was, what do we do with this boy? Do we leave him to grow up with a geisha girl in Japan? Or does he go with the father and the new American woman to America? And so they have a discussion, and they conclude that it's best for the child to go to America. So in the final act of the opera, Chiyo-Chiyo-san calls the little boy off to the side, and she says to the son, look at this face. It is the face of your mother. Remember it. You will never see it again.
Aww.
And with that, the little boy is rushed off with the father, and Chiyo-Chiyo-san ultimately commits suicide. That's the end of the opera.
Yeah.
So when they put it on in Brescia with this new cast, Solomea playing the lead role of Chiyo-Chiyo-san, again, The troupe is nervous. The audience is nervous. But they're there to perform. Uh, uh, Puccini is chain smoking on the side of the theater,
Yeah.
and they put it on. But fortunately, this time, Solomea is able to enchant the audience with her voice. And so they settle down and they listen. And over time, they start playing, they start giving them encore, calls for encores. Now, in those days, I see we're getting a little bit of a voice
Yeah, I
back.
think
Yeah,
it's
we're getting echo in Lisa's room there.
Sorry, I turned it back down.
Okay.
I was
Okay.
having trouble hearing,
Oh,
so
no
I
problem.
turned it up a little, hon. It's fine. Is that
Thanks.
better?
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's better.
About that, Lisa. Anyway, so they performed the opera. She was able to enchant the audience. The audience was somehow taken up by the opera. They called for encores in those days. It's sort of like instant replay in opera style. So what they would do is they get the performers to sing the same opera aria like 3 times or whatever, just to satisfy the audience. They went through that kind of a procedure, and by the end of the opera, they got 7 standing ovations, including Puccini coming out and taking a bow himself.
and it
And
became
that
one of
was
the
the
most
start.
famous operas of all time, right? I mean, Madame Butterfly is world renowned, still performed today, of course. And
Yeah,
um,
it's one of the top, as you mentioned, one of the top operas in the world today.
right.
Um,
Um,
Now, if she performed it 100 times, the role Chio Chio-san, and at the end of the 100th time, she turned the script over back to Puccini and said, "That's it. That's my final performance. I'll move on to other things now." And the reason was she did not favor tragic roles. She preferred strong women roles.
right. Because she
And
was sort of a latter day. She was very like she was a feminist basically.
yes,
She women's rights was very prominent to her.
yeah, she was, first of all, she was an intellect. She had a close circle of friends after this opera experience. In 1910, she married the mayor of the city of Vioreggio, which is it's a town on the western coast of Italy, not far from Milan. And they had a circle of friends like Puccini and the Caruso and all these Toscanini and others, including people from the literature world, from the art world, poets, and so on.
But
So
she was very assertive. It's like many times in her career before she was married, she kind of opted for her career over a domestic lifestyle. I mean, um,
yes,
so she
in
was very
fact,
ambitious and kind of driven, which was kind of unnatural for that age. And it, you know,
I very much appreciate your involvement and the fact that you took the time to read the book and sort of share your sort of responses with me.
I really
It's
enjoyed the book.
delightful to be
I
able
love
to talk to
biography.
someone who knows about it as
Cool.
you do. So it's I'm very happy to be on this recording with you. You're right. Like Toscanini was a notorious womanizer, and he was after her, and they had a great relation. They were because they loved music and song. They were soulmates because of that, and they traveled all over the world. They traveled to Buenos Aires, up to Chile, all over Italy, all over Europe, into Tsarist Russia, in northern Africa, and so on. They traveled, extensively. And many of those trips where Toscanini was leading, the conductor, and Solomea was playing lead roles. And as I mentioned, they became soulmates. in terms of their love for music and performing at the highest level. Tuscanini took a run at her, I think. I know he did. And he writes that she's the only girl or only woman that has ever refused her.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, for what is known, I guess that's the way it was.
Mhm.
Did you like so I'm sorry, did you like growing up, was she like I know you didn't grow up knowing her, right? I'm assuming you're too young for that, but
Well,
was
his
her
mother's named
presence
after
felt
her,
throughout
right?
your household? I mean, were there portraits and your grandmother, did she talk about her a lot? And did
Isn't your mother's name Solomea?
Yes, my mother was named after Solomea, the
this
artist.
obviously very strong
But
presence,
what's that?
obviously very strong,
Yes,
omnipresent spirit there.
influence. Yeah. It was like this, though. When I was growing up, I knew nothing about her. And it was only one day when, I've come home from grade three. I'm a little kid having lunch at home. My mother opens the mail and there's a letter there, and she opens it and she says, "Oh, Tata Solomea Pomerla," which means Aunt Solomea has died. That's the first time I ever heard of her. So I'm like, I don't know, 8 years
Wow.
old or something.
So she was
That was,
alive in your lifetime.
yes, she died in 52. I was born in 49.
Okay.
So that's the first I heard of her. However, because of world events, World War II, my family members were not keen about talking about history.
Hmm.
And so there wasn't very much talk about Solomea, the opera star, in my family at meetings and stuff like that. There was only the occasional fleeting reference to her here and there at a family meeting or in a discussion with one of the people who lived with her from my family. My grandmother talked a little bit about their childhood and things like that. But it was all in passing. It wasn't a feature of the
Hmm.
life. And
Nobody sat
only,
you down and said, "Here's the story."
right. There were moments of, I'll just share one moment. One moment, my aunt, my mother's sister, who was a niece, also like my mother, was a niece to the great opera star. I went to visit, I was in Los Angeles with my aunt, whose name was Helen, and she sat me down. Now, they lived together uh, back in Ukraine before my family members left Ukraine at the end of World War II when things were falling apart. They left, and the star remained behind. So my aunt Helen says to me one time, she's talking Ukrainian. Andriy, that's my name in Ukrainian. Andy, Andriy. Did you know that Aunt Solomea, the opera star, once sang before Tsar Nicholas II and sang Ukrainian patriotic folk songs to him in front of his retinue? And I'm like 14 or 15 years old. I said, no, I didn't know that. Like I hardly knew who was Tsar Nicholas II.
Yeah.
Arch Russia, never mind what happened. But in hindsight, now I know, and just to fill in what that meant was Tsar Nicholas II was a monarch, an autocrat, and someone who made it his life's purpose to destroy the Ukrainian nation,
Yeah.
as is Putin today. There was just among Russian leaders in Tsarist Russia, in the Soviet Union, and in Russia today, there's no love for Ukrainians. Indeed, there was, on the contrary, you guys don't know what you really are. You're Russians. We're going to Russify you,
Mhm.
and they forbid writing, books, music, anything to do with Ukrainian was out. They burned up or destroyed books and all that stuff. So here's the guy who represents the Tsarist Russian Empire. And what happened was he sent out, this is in 1900s, um, around, I don't know, somewhere between 1900 and 1910 anyway. He sends his now the Tsar, Tsar Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, has a summer home not far from Warsaw because Tsarist Russia had occupied a lot of that part of the Eastern Europe. So he sends a general to find Solomea, who's performing in Warsaw, and to invite her to perform before him at his summer palace in a place called Skierniewice in Poland. Now it's in Poland, but back then it was part of Tsarist Russia. And the general comes and he knocks on her door. She's, in the opera theater, and knocks on the door and speaks to her in French, saying, we would like to invite you, Tsar Nicholas II would like to invite you to come and perform in Skierniewice before his retinue at his summer palace. And I'm here to accompany you, your colleagues, for this performance. And she's sitting there, wait a minute, like, I'm a Ukrainian opera star. Like, I am all about Ukraine and Ukrainian music, and this guy's inviting me to go up there to perform. There's a real quandary. But she said in Polish, I'm sorry, in French. They all spoke French, not Russian, but French.
Yeah, I've just read War and Peace pretty recently, and
okay, you got it.
The upper class of Russia at the time, it was all the rage to speak French.
Yeah. So this general says, okay, come on, we're going on the train. They got on the train, they went to Skierniewice, and she's at the Summer Palace. And, okay, they have a concert thing. Now, they did this because Tsar Nicholas II was mourning the death of his father, and so he couldn't go to a theater at that time. So he had a private performance. So she got up and she sang arias from various, languages. And now he invited her because her fame had traveled into Tsarist Russia, and the Tsarist Russian press was talking about this, Italian star. So she performed a few arias, and then he says to her, he says, "Oh, okay, sing a little bit more." And that was her moment, and she started singing Ukrainian folk songs. So so what my aunt Helen was telling me was the irony of the Tsar, who was destroying Ukraine, was listening to the Ukrainian folk songs performed by Solomea.
What was his reaction to that?
As a defiance. Well, after she finished, the Tsar invited her backstage, and he says to her, what were those songs that you were singing? What language was that? And she says, it's Ukrainian. And he says, oh. And there's a pause. And he says, and what is your nationality? And she says, Ukrainian. Another long silence. And he says, oh, my caste told me something different. Yeah. But he was courteous enough to give her some jewelry to thank her for performing.
Right. Sense of propriety or whatever. There was no.
Yeah.
He probably was halfway embarrassed for having.
Yeah. Yeah. He was.
And I have performance too.
Yeah. I have a ring that is descended from him that my mother got.
Oh, interesting. Wow, that's quite the artifact. Wow.
Yeah.
Of course, we know what happened to him and his family.
Yeah, they all got slaughtered by the Bolsheviks.
By the Bolsheviks, Russian Revolution. But
yeah,
wow, there's just amazing stories. As we wind down, I'm like, I was struck by some of the things in the book, the nuances. The reason I asked you if she was such a presence in your home, and if you really had, like her presence was felt at all times, because you seem to have insight into how she would prepare and how she, as a singer, like for instance, the candle test, where you would test the impact of your breath as you were singing on a candle wick. The effects of the fact that she would not speak on the day of her performance.
Yeah.
Um, Things like the impact of the environment. One time she was on a tour of Italy and Mount Vesuvius erupted and the air was contaminated with volcanic gas or whatever, and she had to basically evacuate to save her voice from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All these nuances
And she had
that
to
you
defend
find
a
in the book.
lawsuit for that, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Those are fascinating angles of the book. I did thoroughly enjoy the book. Uh,
There were a few, I don't know if we have much time to go through everything, but there were a few sort of principles that she taught that I think were useful. And speaking to opera in the opera world, I kind of summarized them.
If you have time, we have time.
Okay, I'll just briefly go through them. So she taught, and these were the principles she taught. Music cannot be regarded as so sacred that it can only be performed with inspiration and exaltation. Otherwise, all your work will be in vain, meaning it's not just about inspiration and exaltation, but should say, sing with love, skill, and devotion. And should say, the right tone is the one in which it is easiest for you to transition to forte as well as pianissimo, high and low, or fast and slow. If you prolong a high note, how long it should be held should depend not on your trained breathing, but on the audience's endurance. If you hold a note beyond the tolerance of the audience, your singing will never be considered professional. Every work, indeed every rehearsal, should be performed with excellence. If you know how to recite poetry, you know how to sing. As a singer, you must find your own road to perfection. If you are not nervous before a performance, you will never experience your role, and therefore you will not perform as an artist, but only as a craftsman. As a singer, you should inspire the audience not only to listen to your singing, but also to experience with you what you are experiencing in your performance. If the work does not move the audience, the performer has not reached the goal. You should sing in such a way that, above all else, you love singing. Without persistent, everyday work on yourself, it is impossible to achieve total command over your voice. Confidence in yourself is the foundation of success. We're almost through here. In life, you should do everything in rhythm and good tempo, but never in haste. Finally, a good teacher is someone who understands the natural voice of a student. That was her sort of philosophy of teaching.
right.
Cool.
And she went into like when her career was winding down, she taught operatic singing, right? And we should, I don't want to gloss over the importance of world events because they were so impactful on probably her legacy. The events of World War II left her basically behind the Iron Curtain, right, for the
Yeah.
remainder of her life. And the whole Stalinist Russia, the whole pop culture, I guess, or the whole cultural movement was to suppress anything that was not Russian. And, so that had a profound impact on her legacy. Um, but eventually, uh, she perseveres through people like yourself and her recordings and your daughter.
Yeah.
Uh, and I love it that you're bringing to life her, her story for everybody to
Thank
appreciate.
you. Yeah. Just share this last little sort of insight. Towards the end of her life, she's in her late years, 80s, I guess. And the war goes through, like Nazi Germany and Soviet Union clash, and Stalingrad happens, where the Red Army is crushed, and the Red Army crushes the German army, and the Red Army marches westward, coming across ultimately to go to Berlin, and the war will end. And as it came through Ukraine and Lviv, which is where she was, and where my family lived through World War II with her, in one apartment in her building, with the Holocaust going on and everything on the streets, etc. In the darkest days of the war, they lived together. But as the army was coming through, they had to make some sea change, fundamental decisions about life. In her case, she was older. She had broken her leg, and she was wobbly on her feet. She was looking after a sister who was emotionally ill, mentally ill. And it just wasn't for her to be able to pick up and leave and go to Italy, where she left her her villa.
Mhm.
And she decided, I have to stay. I cannot go. Other parts of my family, my family part, left and traveled to North America before the Red Army came in. Other parts decided to stay, and they were exiled into Siberia. Others at that time were killed and so on by the Soviet Union. So by 1952, when she was, after they had come through, that was 45. From 45 to 52 was a period of great hardship in the Soviet Union, but she managed her way. She taught singing, and she became a professor, and she was teaching at the school where she herself learned. And what I read to you was her philosophy of teaching at that time, those points. But she died in 52. And after her death, because the Soviet Union didn't want to glorify a Ukrainian opera star, her name vanished. But the names of others, like Tuscanini, he went to the United States and became the conductor to the NBC.
I mean, he wasn't Ukrainian either.
No, he wasn't Italian.
Yeah, all the Italian names made it
Yeah.
through
Interesting.
history.
You recounted an event where Tuscanini was actually roughed up by
Yeah,
was by
Mussolini.
Mussolini's.
Mussolini comes into the concert hall. Toscanini is conducting, and Mussolini demands that Toscanini start the concert with the Italian fascist anthem. And Mussolini goes, "No, I'm not going to start." So he breaks his conductor's wand and walks off the stage. And that was very dangerous because fascist Italy had arisen. So he escaped. He escaped to New York and was the conductor of the NBC choir or symphony. Uh, uh, Puccini died before World War II broke out, so he didn't suffer any of the indignities and so on. But others, this guy named Ruffo, had some hard times with the fascists and so on. One of the singers.
Right. Those are
So
good lessons to know. You don't want it's so easy to dismiss that error, and it's like, oh, it was just an extraordinary time, or people lost sight of history and allowed that to happen, but that can never happen again. But then you see people get elected today that kind of espouse the same sort of.
yeah, here we are again.
Yeah.
But so they played her down, but her memory remains. And we got a book, we got a film, and there are concerts
You
going
got
on.
a statue in
Let me just
Poland.
share this one little thought with you. Unbelievable experience. In the middle of the war, this war where Russia's invading Ukraine, on the 150th anniversary of her birth, Solomea's birth, they perform a concert at the Lviv Opera Theater and broadcast it worldwide. You can get it on YouTube if you look for it. Like they actually did a performance in the middle of the war. Like they announced we're doing it. We may have to adjourn this concert because there may be bombs flying here. But so long as we're safe, we're putting on this concert. And they had a conductor come in from Italy, one of the best conductors in the world, to lead the concert. And they performed all the main arias that she performed and so on. And similar concerts have been held. This is the 120th anniversary of the successful performance of Madame Butterfly this year.
Wow.
And for example, in Toronto in January, they're putting on Madame Butterfly as an opera. I think it was on somewhere in Milwaukee, I think, this year. So it's around still.
Yeah, I'm not like I appreciate opera. I've always, when I was younger, I was like, I really I bought into the pageantry of it and like the theatricality of it, and I had like I liked
In high school,
Julia
you probably
McGinnis.
knew more about opera than anybody I knew.
Who's that?
You.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, Julia McGinnis Johnson. I liked her.
Oh,
She performed the film of Carmen, and then Kathleen Battle. I thought she was beautiful, so I was always mesmerized. I'd watch the great performances on PBS.
oh yeah.
I'd catch
Yeah.
those. I'd sit there, and it's I don't know why. I can't say that I really have a really in-tuned ear or whatever, but I did find it fascinating. Leontine Price, these prima donnas. They have, there is you can imagine before the age of movies and, a lot of stage plays and everything, going back to the 17, 1800s, that this was actually the pinnacle of entertainment,
Yeah. Yeah.
And
There's a lot there.
yeah.
Listen, guys, I very much appreciate all of you, Lisa, Aaron, and you, Philip, for taking this time to share these moments with me, especially that you read the book, and I'm happy that you enjoyed it. And
I really did. I really did. And where can we find the book? Where can people get the load?
it's on Amazon. It's also an audiobook that you can get on Amazon. Or any of the others, Barnes and Noble.
The audiobook comes with the performance too, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I did listen to the audiobook, and I have to say, I'm glad I did because it helped with the pronunciation of a lot of the names. I don't think I would have got Solomea fine, but the Krushelnytska, I don't think I would have got that. And
Krushelnytska.
Nitska, right?
Yeah, Krushelnytska. It's a tough name, I know.
All right.
But what can you do? That's the way it is.
We
Well,
have
we'll go ahead and
social.
call
Twitter,
Yeah, pod.
Instagram,
Yeah, pod.
Facebook.
Yeah, pod. So let us know. Hit us back. Have a great week.